So today we're going to be talking about the launch years, or why our 20s are so important and why we should use them now to launch a really successful future for ourselves. My name is Natalie Lascano. I am currently the wellness coordinator with UFHR, but I did previously, very recently, work with Gator Care as their health education intern. So I still collaborate with them in my new role. So I am still giving this presentation on behalf of Gator Care. And so today we're going to talk about how to launch a successful life in your 20s, because there's actually a lot of research to suggest that our 20s might be one of the most important, or is the most important decade for making really positive behavior changes. And we're going to talk about how that can relate to our career, our relationships, and our overall longevity. But I just want to say before we get started that the information presented here, it's not necessarily only applicable to people in their 20s. There will be a whole section of this presentation that is meant for mentors of 20-somethings, so they can kind of help to guide the 20-somethings they care about, whether it's as a parent or a guardian or a professor or a manager, whatever role that may be in. But you can certainly apply the information to your own life, even if you are not in your 20s. And in no way is this presentation meant to prescribe a certain kind of lifestyle to you. I'm not telling you how to lead your life. I'm just trying to help you figure out what it is you want for your life and how to kind of make that happen for yourself. So this is just meant to encourage you to think about what you want and how to make that happen. And this presentation is based almost entirely on the book, The Defining Decade by Dr. Meg Jay, who is a clinical psychologist. And it also takes a few notes from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is another book by Stephen Covey. So I do suggest, if you find this presentation really interesting, to further your learning by reading those books. All right. All right, so before we get into the actual content of this presentation, I'd like to go through a little mental exercise with all of you. So I'd like you to take a moment and close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and imagine yourself as you are right now. So think about your physical features, like what you see reflected back in the mirror in the morning, and picture your current lifestyle and hobbies. What do you like to do? What's your day-to-day life like? And now in a second, I'm going to launch a poll, and I'd like you in this poll to select how much money you would like to save right now for retirement each month while picturing your current self and your current lifestyle. And this is not how much money you are capable of saving right now based on how much you make, but how much you would like to save given those ranges. I'll give you all a second to do that. Okay, so I think we've gotten almost every response. Give it just a couple more seconds. All right. And so now again, I would like you to close your eyes and picture yourself, but now I'd like you to picture yourself at 70 years old. So what does this version of yourself like? What lifestyle and hobbies does this person enjoy? And how have you changed in the intervening decades? And what family structure and has this person built for themselves over the years? And so I really want you to take a moment and picture yourself at 70 years old. And then, hold on, I will launch another poll. So again, you're going to pick how much money you'd like to save right now each month for retirement while only thinking about this older version of yourself. I'll give you a couple more seconds to do that. Okay. Give you a couple more seconds. All right. Perfect. Okay. So now using the raise your hand feature on Zoom, or just putting it in the chat, how many of you saved more for the younger version of yourself than the older version? Okay. And how many of you saved the same amount for the younger version of yourself as well as the older version? It's the same amount in both. All right. So it's kind of hard to tell because you guys are all narrowed down on my screen. And lastly, how many of you saved more for the older version than the younger version? I'm seeing a few hands. So ideally, you would have said that you saved more for the older version of yourself. And this is because there's usually kind of an empathy gap between yourself as you are right now and the older version of yourself because they don't exist to us right now, right? But when we are picturing ourselves when we're older, we realize that that person is going to exist and that they're us and that we want to be able to take care of ourselves when that time comes. And the good news is that you can take care of your older self, but you do have to start now because what you do in your 20s will largely determine who you are and what you're able to do in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. And so hopefully this presentation will be kind of helpful for you in thinking about how you can make that happen. Now we'll talk about why it is that our 20s are so important to us. So the first reason, one of the major reasons, is because our 20s are our final stage of brain development. So starting at adolescence through our early 20s, our brain is experiencing a second growth spurt where it creates thousands more neurons and neural connections than it actually needs. And then it goes along pruning those neurons and connections that are not actually used. And so this process will end around age 25. And that's why you may commonly hear people saying that you're not fully mature until age 25. It's because you quite literally are not. Your brain is still developing. But because your brain is developing so much and growing so much and creating all these new connections, this actually makes it the easiest time for us to change our behaviors for better or for worse, because our brains are really soaking in whatever is around us and whatever we're doing day to day. So it's very much like how a newborn acquires language in its early life. A newborn is going through that same sort of brain development that we're experiencing right now in our early 20s. And this also means that 20-somethings who use this time to challenge themselves with real jobs and real relationships and new experiences end up adapting better to the stresses of adulthood throughout life because you're basically training your brain to handle these situations now when you're young. And our 20s are also important because it's the period where we lose the structure of school. So our environments are changing very rapidly. And as we graduate from college, we're losing the structure of semesters and syllabi and these really well-defined goals. So instead of knowing that we need to get a certain grade in a class by a certain time period, we now have to work on building a career or buying a house or choosing insurance or choosing a partner, maybe becoming a parent. These really big goals and commitments that are not necessarily for everyone and don't really have any specific deadlines. There's no real deadline for when you're supposed to like buy a house, right? It's just kind of something you think you should get to at some point if that's what you want. And then the last reason why our 20s are so important is because research shows that 80% of life's most defining moments happen by age 35. And so this doesn't necessarily mean those milestone moments that may have like first come to your mind, such as like graduating college and getting married, stuff like that. It really includes some minor interactions and decisions that you don't really think about but actually lead to these milestone moments. So for example, if you agree to a last minute interview with a professional and they end up giving you a job that leads to your future career, that was kind of a last minute decision. It was kind of just a happenstance, but it led to your career and it led to the rest of your life. So those are what we mean by our most defining moments. They're things we don't really think about, but they have a really big impact on how our life turns out. So the decisions we make or don't make during this time will have a really tremendous impact on our future financial, social, and health outcomes. But again, these decisions are being made while our brain is still really reactive and it's still developing its forward-thinking capacities, which are what allow us to calculate risk and reward, analyze uncertain situations, and predict future outcomes. So this kind of creates a catch-22, right? We have to make decisions that are going to determine the rest of our lives, but our brains haven't finished developing the ability to make those decisions in the best way possible. So naturally, this can lead you to feeling very overwhelmed by the magnitude and the quantity of possibilities that you have before you. But again, hopefully the information that you learn here is going to help you think about what's important in making those decisions. And so this leads me into the unthought known. And our unthought known are those things that we know about ourselves, but we kind of forget somehow, or we don't really think about it often. They're the dreams and the aspirations that we have, but that we kind of lose sight of due to the pressures of everyday life. And this can be anything. It can be both a professional or a personal goal. It's just something that you may have always wanted, or you just recently discovered that you wanted, but you don't really know how to work towards it, or it kind of just gets left to the wayside because you're too busy with school or work and you can't really work on it all the time. But this is important because as 20-somethings, we often worry about choosing the wrong thing when making these life-defining decisions. And maybe sometimes we look to others to make these decisions for us. But of course, that's not possible because we're responsible for ourselves. But when we think about our unthought known, we realize that we have some idea of what we want our careers and our personal lives to be like. So that really narrows down our choices when we have a lot of choices in front of us. Because our past really informs our future. And so we kind of have more of a path to follow when we're thinking about our unthought known and where to go next. So I'd like you to take a moment now. You'll see in your handout, you have a little space to write your unthought known. So I'd like you to just write down what your unthought known is. And again, it can be anything. It can be school related, work related, just a personal goal. For example, my unthought known is to buy an Airstream and travel around the country living in my Airstream and working freelance and having that much freedom. So just write down whatever your unthought known may be. And if you want, you can also share it in the chat, but you certainly don't have to. So I'll give you a few moments to do that. Okay. So moving on, so now we're going to start talking about careers. So we may think that we have until retirement, which is typically around age 65, to make as much money as we need to attain our desired standard of living. However, data from the US Census Bureau and from PayScale, which is shown here, actually shows that our salaries will peak and plateau by our 40s, which is true across low wage and high wage earners. So you can see here on this first graph, which follows the median income for men from when they first enter the workforce to just about when they leave the workforce around age 64, around age 65, you can see in this first couple decades of their career, the growth is really exponential. And it's around age 40 that it kind of flattens out. And really the only increases that we're seeing from age 40 on are just cost of living adjustments that employers provide to keep pace with inflation. And you can see the same thing happening in this graph, which shows the percent earnings growth for women. Again, the numbers got kind of wonky here when I downloaded this presentation, but it's supposed to be 22 and 26, so on and so forth. You can see the same thing is happening. So around age 22 through around age 42, there's really all this exponential growth in the wage earnings, and then it just kind of flattens out until a point when they eventually leave the workforce. So this means that our 20s are a really important period for our career advancement because the types of jobs that we engage with early on in our career are going to determine and what we gain from those jobs early on is largely going to determine our earning potential later on in life. And even if money isn't what you're after, the connections you make right out of school are also going to help or hinder you from creating the career that you want for yourself. So what should we think about when we're trying to start our early career? So the first thing we want to think about is building identity capital. So identity capital is our stock of personal assets, which includes experiences and skills that we would list on a resume, but it also includes our hobbies, interests, and our personal experiences. So this is just the accumulation of all the skills that we gain from both work and exploration. However, this does not mean that you should be just about work or just about exploration. Neither one is healthy. You really want to find a middle ground because research shows that those who explore new interests and opportunities while also making commitments form stronger identities. So they have a stronger sense of self, greater life satisfaction, better stress management, stronger reasoning, and they also resist conformity to a larger degree. So, right, all the things we want for ourselves. And this doesn't mean that every job you're going to have is going to be super glamorous. In fact, it's a lot more likely that you'll be underemployed at some point, meaning that the skills you have kind of exceed what your job responsibilities are. But what's important is that from each job that you have, you're gaining skills that you can use later on. So this means you kind of have to avoid having a clock in, clock out mentality when where you're kind of just showing up to work for nothing more than a paycheck. You want to make sure you're really engaged with whatever job that you have. So one good example of identity capital from my personal experience, not necessarily with a job, but it was actually with a medical club called HOSA that I was involved with in high school. I was involved with it from my freshman year to my senior year. By my senior year, I was the president of the club. I had had a lot of really great experiences. I had been able to do hospital rotations. I had done community education, community outreach presentations. I'd done a lot of volunteering. I'd gone to competitions. I really learned a lot throughout those 4 years of that experience in high school, and I actually ended up gaining a lot of education and leadership skills through that club experience, and it actually led me to the major that I chose in college, and eventually it led me to the job that I have today. And I actually talked about that experience when I was interviewing for this job. So you can see how, something you may think is so kind of minimal in the grand scheme of things, something that you did in high school can still have a really big impact on who you are today. And you can still draw on that to build your identity capital. So on your handout, you'll see that you also have a space to jot down a couple of your identity capital. So I'll just give you a moment to write a few pieces of identity capital you think you have that are the most valuable to you and will be most valuable to you moving forward with your career. Give you a few minutes for that, or a few seconds. And so next, with our career, we really want to seek out and use our weak ties. So our weak ties are the people we know maybe as acquaintances or in passing, but that are not part of our inner circle. So they're not the people we're hanging out with on the weekend. They're more like our professors or upper level management or people that we've only spoken to once. And you may be thinking, why is someone who I've only spoken to once important to me? And it's actually because these people have a lot more and different connections than you may have. So they can help us to build our network. So you can kind of think of your professional network as a web, and each person around you branches off into further and further connections. And there's research actually suggests that more than 3/4 of new jobs come from contacts seen only occasionally or rarely. So one example I have of this is actually my dad. He just got a job with Carnival Cruises after working with a State Department for over 20 years. And the way he got that job is because someone he worked with in the State Department over a decade ago ended up switching to Carnival Cruises many years ago, but remembered his experience with my dad. So when a position became open with Carnival Cruises, he emailed my dad and asked for his resume and then sent my dad's resume along to the interviewers. And now my dad has a new job. So you can see how that weak tie helped my dad to get a better position. And when you think about it, this is actually the genius of LinkedIn. And in the toolkit that you can receive at the end of this presentation, if you complete the post survey, there'll be a whole page on how to use LinkedIn to your advantage. But yeah, this is basically the genius of LinkedIn. On that platform, you're basically seeking out your weak ties who maybe you met at a networking event, or maybe you haven't met at all, but they're part of your field of interest. So you follow them, maybe you message them and ask if they have any open positions in their job. That's really what LinkedIn is. It's using your weak ties. But you want to keep in mind that when you are seeking out your weak ties and looking for help from your weak ties, what you're really looking for is small favors, such as passing along your resume or providing contact info for a potential manager. You're not going to be asking these people to, read your entire dissertation or your entire thesis or something big like that, because they don't know you that well and they don't have the time really for that, or you can't assume that they do. You're just asking for those really small favors, which are going to end up being mutually beneficial because you get a new opportunity and they get a helper's high, which is, the chemicals that are released in our brain that make us feel good when we've helped someone. So in order to approach your weak ties, what you want to do is make yourself relevant. So kind of remind them of how you know them or how you're connected to them. And you want to know exactly what you need. You want to be very specific about what it is that you need from them. And then of course, just ask politely. So next thing you're going to want to do in your early career is to really consider your customized life. And by this, I mean picking out the pieces of your professional and personal story that you think sets you apart from everyone else in the room. And you want this to be a story rather than a list. So it is a little bit different than the identity capital in that you're not just listing the skills that you've gained from these professional and personal experiences, but really a story of how your past experience relates to what you want your future career and life to be like, and how whatever job or opportunity that you're currently interviewing for or currently applying for is going to help you reach that ultimate goal. So you can think of this as basically your elevator pitch. That is essentially what it is. And again, in the toolkit that you can receive at the end of this presentation, there will be another page dedicated to tips on how to build your or craft your elevator pitch to be really effective. The next thing we're going to talk about is dating and marriage. And again, in no way is this meant to tell you that you need to be married or you need to be in a relationship. Not at all. The statistics presented here are just to show you how our cultural perception of dating and marriage have really changed drastically from our parents and our grandparents' generations. So you can see here, in the 1950s, the average marrying age of women was 20 and the average marrying age of 22. But right here you can see that by 2018, according to US Census Bureau, the average marrying age of women was 28 and the average marrying age of men was 30. So you can see there's almost a decade of difference between when our grandparents were getting married and when people of our generation are typically getting married. Another big change in marriage statistics has been in the educational attainment of who is getting married. So in 1990, the non-college educated were far more likely to be married by age 30 than were the college educated. Maybe not far more likely, but they're definitely more likely to be married by 30 than the college educated. But you can also see by 2008 that the college educated have creeped past the non-college educated on who is married by age 30. And lastly, 50% of young singles say that a career is as important as love, whereas a couple generations ago, young singles would have said that love was more important than career. So what all of this data is telling us is that marriage is now seen more as a capstone of adulthood. It's kind of a symbol that we have everything else in place. We have our finances in place, our career is in a good spot, we have a place to live, we're settled down, everything's going smoothly, so now I'm ready to get married. So our culture has shifted from seeing marriage as an initial transition phase into adulthood into kind of a capstone of adulthood. And people are now doing a lot more in between, leaving their parents' house and then getting married. Whereas people used to be moving out of their parents' house, moving directly into a house with their spouse. Now people are going to college, they're changing cities a few times, they're typically dating more as well. So our whole culture has kind of changed. And again, this is not to say that you have to get married. It's just to show you how things have changed and to consider how that could impact your own relationship decision making. So our relationship, or who we decide to partner with is likely going to be one of the most important decisions we make in our life, because once you've partnered with someone, it's likely that your finances are tied together. You may have children with them. You probably have a house with them. A lot of things are going to be tied together, and it's going to be really hard, even if you separate, to kind of separate everything that you've shared with that person. So it is going to be a really important decision that you make. And so that means that the best time to work on your future relationship is before you're in one. So the most important thing to do with that is to take yourself and your relationship seriously. So how you communicate, resolve conflicts, express affection, and navigate difficulties are all being decided right now. And if there's a problem in any of those areas, it's going to be a lot easier to change them now in your 20s than it will be later on. Because again, your brain is developing and it's choosing the habits that it's going to take with it throughout the rest of your life. So it's going to be a lot easier to change those habits and behaviors now than it will be later on. And also being cognizant of your dating decisions allows you to exercise a lot more control over the kind of relationships you find yourself in, as well as prevents you from settling for a lesser relationship later down the line when you feel pressured to because your siblings are married or your friends are all getting married, they're all having children, so you feel like you need to catch up with them. But you need to remember that you're not behind or ahead just because your relationship status looks different from your peers. There's really no correct timeline or lifestyle that everyone needs to follow. The important thing is just, again, to take yourself seriously and to really be conscientious in what your relationships are like so you can exercise control over them. One second. The next thing you want to think about is that you're picking your family. So who you partner with is likely to come with a family that's going to have to mesh with you and your family. And ideally, these will be the people who are with you to celebrate every major milestone and who you will be able to rely on in an emergency. So this doesn't mean that you should dump someone just because you hate their family, but just consider whether you can handle that family dynamic for the rest of your life, and if those are the people that you want to have with you for every milestone and possibly every emergency as well. I'd also like to stress the importance of prioritizing your platonic relationships or your friendships just as much as your romantic relationships. So in our 20s, we often put more focus on the amount of friends we have over the quality of those friendships. But this can really influence our 30s and later down the line when we shift our focus to the quality of our friendships over the quantity because we have a lot more demands on our time. So you can't really be hanging out with as many people as we were hanging out with in our 20s. So this means that the people that we make really strong, reliable friendships with in our 20s are likely going to be the same people that we see on the weekends in our 40s. So you really want to focus now on your friendships just as much as your romantic relationships to kind of fend off loneliness and isolation in later decades because we're human and we're pack animals and we want to have people around us. That's just who we are. So in your handout, you'll also see a section for relationships. And right there, I'd just like you to write down one thing you can do today. It can be something really small, just like sending a text message or something like that to strengthen any important relationship to you. And that can be like a friendship, a romantic relationship, a relationship with your parents or your grandparents. It can be any relationship, but just like you to think of one thing you can do today after this presentation to reach out to that person and kind of remind them of how grateful you are for them. So next we'll be talking about longevity, which is one of the main topics of this presentation, and it doesn't just refer to how many years we live, but rather the quality of those years and the resilience of our careers, relationships, and overall lifestyles. So this requires taking care of your body and mind physically, as well as implementing habits and practices that are going to allow you to grow and improve in all areas of your life. So you can see here in what I've called the longevity solar system, we of course have longevity at the center, but then all of these planets around it are kind of the basic elements that are going to contribute to our longevity. So we have healthy habits, our personal purpose, our desire for growth, our desire to constantly be learning, our goals that we're always working towards, our body and mind, of course, taking care of our physical and mental health, our drive to improve ourselves, and of course, the self-care habits we practice to show ourselves that we care about ourselves. And again, so in your handout, you'll see that you have a longevity solar system of your own. So I'd also like you to take a few seconds to write down what's in your longevity solar system. And this can be exactly the same as to what's on here. It can be entirely different. It's just whatever you feel like contributes to your overall longevity. And it can also include certain relationships. It could be certain places. It can really be anything that really kind of rejuvenates you. And as you're writing those down in your longevity solar system, I'd also like you to think about what you can do to start prioritizing those elements more in your day-to-day life. I'll give you a few seconds for that as well. All right. So moving on to major topics of longevity. First thing I want to talk about is the importance of getting along and getting ahead. So this is based on the social investment theory, which basically states that getting involved in the world around us is how we grow and create positive outcomes for ourselves. So if we get along, we will get ahead. So this means stuff like starting a career, getting married, buying a house or car, etc., are all adult commitments that really force us to mature in an extremely valuable way. And the first step you can take with this is with your work. Work or school is where we spend most of our waking hours, and it usually comes before romantic commitment, as we saw in the previous section. So it's really the greatest driver of personality changes in our 20s. And research has shown that 20-somethings who enjoy some level of workplace success or financial security are naturally more confident, positive, and responsible. So this means that you want to set goals for yourself at work and potentially elsewhere and really work hard until you achieve those goals. And again, you want to let go of that clock in, clock out mentality that we talked about earlier. And so to help you with this, there's actually a SMART goals page in the toolkit, which kind of it's a framework for how to set goals that you're more likely to achieve. So you can go through that page in the toolkit, and you can set your own goals for yourself that you are more likely to achieve. The next thing you want to think about with longevity is learning to calm ourselves first. So our brain naturally tends to remember something surprising or upsetting vividly and for longer. These are referred to as flashbulb memories because our brain is trying to learn how to protect us if or when the same thing happens to us again. So that's how our brain copes with a difficult situation. And 20-somethings naturally have a lot of these flashbulb memories because many of our experiences are new to us. Our careers are new to us. Life after college is new to us. Again, everything's really changing for us. So we tend to have a lot of these flashbulb memories. And in these situations, we often want to rely on just quitting the situation altogether. So for example, if you have a really strict and hard boss, who really comes down on you sometimes, you may think you should just quit the job altogether. And maybe in some situations, extreme situations, that may be the right thing to do. But most of the time, you do kind of just have to grin and bear it, for lack of a better term. And you may think that that's too hard or it's unfair. But what happens when you just quit a situation, again, unless it's like a really extreme situation, it's a situation you should get out of. What that does is just it weakens our ability to regulate our emotion and reduces our problem-solving skills. So instead, practicing mindfulness and meditation techniques to calm yourself and reevaluate the situation can help you approach it from a different lens and solve the problem rather than just trying to quit something that's difficult. So a common technique for mindfulness and resilience is called reframing. So this is just when you change your thoughts from something like, this is too difficult for me to handle, to I can overcome this just as I have overcome all obstacles in my life. So what you're doing with this is whenever you have a negative thought about yourself or about a situation, you immediately stop, you take a second, and you reframe that thought into something positive and that's more constructive, and it's going to help you to move on. So that's just one mindfulness technique that you can use. There's many, many more. I don't really have the time to share them all here. But in your toolkit, there will be some resources and links to other practices that you can try to help you with that. Right. And the last thing you want to do with longevity is, of course, nurture your body and mind. So this is all about, proper nutrition and proper exercise, stuff like that, the things we all know that we should be doing, because this is really the foundation of longevity. And again, I don't have time to get into, the basics of nutrition and the basics of exercise in this presentation, but you can explore the Gator Care page for resources on all of those topics and just make sure to prioritize all dimensions of wellness. So next we'll be talking about life management. And so what's presented here, these 4 quadrants, are a life management technique that's based on the Pareto principle, which means that 80% of our results flow out of 20% of our activities. So you should concentrate your activities on the most important tasks with the greatest long-term payoff. So the quadrants we have here show the 4 general types of activities, which are categorized by importance and urgency. So in quadrant 1, we have those activities that are important and urgent. So these are our crises, our pressing problems, and our deadlines. So a big project that's coming up, that would be an important and urgent. And then in quadrant 2, we have important and not urgent, which refers to our prevention tasks, relationship building, new opportunities, or seeking out new opportunities, planning, and recreation. So the things that rejuvenate us and will help us to reach long-term goals are in quadrant 2. In quadrant 3, we have our non-important but urgent. So these are our interruptions, such as phone calls, meetings, and mail that are not necessarily related to our role, but they get sent to us anyway, and for some reason we have to respond, or whatever the case may be. And then quadrant 4, we have the non-important and not urgent tasks, which are our trivial or busy work, our time wasters, our pleasant activities with no real purpose that don't really serve to rejuvenate us. So an example of that would be like social media. It's nice to scroll through social media, but it doesn't really do a lot for us. So I'd like you to take a moment now and think about which quadrant do you think is most important, and you can answer in the chat, please. So again, we have quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. Right. Yes. Right, so urgent and important, quadrant 1 is definitely one of the most important quadrants, but it's actually quadrant 2, which is our most important quadrant, because the activities here really further our progress towards our long-term goals, or our unthought known, like we talked about earlier. They make us more effective in our various roles, and we know we have to do them because they're going to have a really good long-term effect on our lives, but they kind of get pushed to the side because, again, they're not urgent and they don't necessarily have deadlines. Right. And then on this next slide, I have an example of the same quadrant, but with kind of my own tasks in each one. So you kind of get an idea of what each one is like. So in quadrant 1, I have drafting the weekly newsletter. That's a project. It has a deadline. It has to get done. It's part of my job. In quadrant 2, we have earning my professional certification, which could help me to get jobs later down the line. It gives me more credibility, but I don't need it for the job I have now, so I don't really have to get it, or it doesn't really have a deadline. And then in our not important but urgent, we have brainstorming new project ideas. It's urgent because I need to have more projects to work on, but it's not important right now because I have other projects I'm working on. And then in non-important and not urgent in quadrant 4, we have responding to non-work emails. So you can see how that's just a time waster. It's not really relevant to anything else I do. Oh yeah, and so now you have, in your handout, you have your own quadrants on page 2. So I'd like you to take a moment now to fill in your quadrants with things for each that would align with each quadrant. So I'll give you a few moments to do that. And again, you really want to focus on quadrant 2, what's important but not urgent, but is going to have really long-term payoff and really help you later down the line. So once you've taken a moment to do that, now I'll talk about how to use the quadrant tool in a really practical way, which is by using it to make a weekly plan. So in this, you'd be planning your week, your entire week in advance. So maybe on a Sunday, you would plan your entire week for starting Monday to the next Sunday. And so this is more effective than doing a kind of daily to-do list and planning your days one at a time, as they come up, because you're seeing kind of a long-term or longer-term path for everything that you need to do. So based on your quadrant that you made, you can build out certain action items for each activity or task that you put in each quadrant, and then you can distribute them along the days of the week, starting with your quadrant 2 activities. So you can see here on this example weekly plan, I have on Monday, the first thing I'm going to do is apply for my certification exam. And And so I know as soon as the week starts, I'm going to start working towards that certification, which again, it's not urgent, but it's going to help me later on in the long term. And you can see I've added other things such as scheduling the certification exam and taking a practice exam throughout the week as well. So I'm constantly working on that quadrant 2 activity that's going to have the longest term payoff throughout the week. And then everything else I've listed is related either to quadrant 1 or quadrant 3. And then everything from quadrant 4 is kind of just streamlined, delegated, or otherwise thrown out altogether because it really serves no purpose for me. Um, yeah. And in the toolkit, there'll also be a space for you to plan out your week. So you can kind of practice the same thing of looking at your quadrant activities, building out action items from each one, and then distributing them across the week. Okay. So now for all the mentors who are with us today, here are a few things you can do to help your 20-something, again, in whatever capacity that may be, whether you're a parent, a guardian, a professor, whatever it may be. So the first thing would be to practice empathic listening. And so the idea here is to seek first to understand rather than to be understood. So what you're going to do is avoid evaluating, probing, advising, and interpreting when responding to your 20-something. You're really recognizing that your frame of reference is different from the person you're talking to, and you're actively trying to view the situation from that person's frame of reference. And you avoid bringing up your own experiences unless specifically asked, because a lot of times when we're in conversation with someone, we kind of just want to say what we did in a similar situation so that maybe they can do the same thing. And we think that's helpful, but oftentimes the person we're talking to, for whatever reason, maybe can't do that same thing, or it'd be harder for them to do that rather than something else. So you really want to see things from another person's frame of reference. And again, there'll be more information on this available in the toolkit and a framework that you can follow for practicing this. And the next thing you want to do is be a transition person. So transition person commonly refers to a person who breaks with harmful dynamics and learned behaviors that are passed down through generations within a family, but it can also apply to organizations, communities, and other affiliations. So for example, if you know your workplace has a very competitive atmosphere that's doing more harm than good, then you might want to try changing the culture and fostering a more win-win mentality among your coworkers so that future team members can inherit that environment instead, and it can be a more team-based environment rather than a competitive one. You also want to allow your 20-something to make their own decisions because people learn through their own mistakes and their own experiences. And oftentimes the consequences of these decisions can be painful. They're not always good, but they do help to build character because they show us what we enjoy, what we're good at, and what motivates us, and vice versa. And so being a good mentor means sharing your honest opinion when asked, while at the same time allowing your mentee, your 20-something, to make their own decisions and experiencing the consequences rather than trying to shield them from them, whether they're good or bad. And you also want to be a role model for a successful life and show that a successful life doesn't have to just be a cookie cutter mold. It can really be whatever it is that feels most true to you. And of course, this is good because it's always better to practice what you preach rather than just preach at someone. No one really likes to be told what to do, but people are naturally very observant and are more likely to follow a good example if it's right in front of them and salient to them rather than a bad example. So I'd like to conclude by talking about the law of 10,000 hours, which comes from research done by K. Anders Ericsson, which shows that people who are especially good at something have spent about 10,000 hours practicing that thing, which typically equates to about 5 years of focus or full-time work. So if you think about your favorite sports player or musician, they may have been born with a natural talent, but it was really the relentless hours of practice that made them truly good at what they do. And you may be thinking that, 10,000 hours sounds like a huge commitment, and there's no way you can invest that amount of time into something. But you have to remember that by the time we're in our 20s, we're really not at 0 hours total. We already have some time invested in what we're meant to do because we have a really good idea of what we like and what we're good at and what we want, again, what we want our lives to be like. So whenever you're thinking that you're failing at, being an adult, whatever that may mean, or that a project or a situation isn't going your way, just remember that this is part of your 10,000 hours. You're still in training. And again, your brain is really still developing during this time period. And everything, your whole environment is new to you. So you can't expect yourself to always be great at everything. And even after you've reached your 10,000 hours, you're going to slip up a few times. You're going to mess up a few times. And that's okay too. Even LeBron James doesn't make every shot he throws. Even Taylor Swift doesn't break records with every single album. You know, there's still always room to fail and to learn and to grow from that. And finally, I just want to encourage you to use what you've learned today to work towards your unthought known that you thought about earlier, so that when you are the older version of yourself that you imagined at the beginning of this presentation, you have something that you can look back on and be truly proud of. And so again, please take this post survey. You can scan the QR code below. I can also find the link for you and put it in the chat. Please take that post survey. Let us know what you thought about this presentation. And as soon as you finished it, the toolkit will be sent to your